Hello and welcome to another Tuesday Talk with Ruby Reese. My name is Killian. I am co-founder at Ruby Reese and at dognutrition.ie, and I'll also be your host. This week we're going to have a little bit of a different format, so if it's your very first time listening in and you want to see what our usual format is like, I really recommend you going back and checking out some of the older episodes. We have lots and lots of them with loads of guests and really exciting topics to browse through. But if you're here to listen to my chats all about feeding dogs with a raw diet, then obviously stick around and listen into that. So as I mentioned, it is me, myself and I that is on this week to speak. And I suppose for us at Ruby Reese and dognutrition.ie, raw feeding is a topic that we are very passionate about. It's something we know quite a bit about. We wouldn't say that we're absolute know-it-alls, but we absolutely have read into this and looked up on this and learned about it and certified in nutrition in and around a raw feeding diet. And I suppose our whole journey started, as many of you listeners know, through our own French bulldog Ruby, who was born with food allergies. And we quickly realized that raw feeding was the way to go for us, and it's definitely not something that we say is for absolutely everyone, but for us it made an awful lot of sense, and I'll get into some of the reasons later, but it does work for us, but it may not be for everyone. So why did I decide to speak about this topic this week? I suppose there's a lot of interest and growing interest in the Irish dog community in and around raw and home-cooked diets, and that's for a multitude of reasons. We think the most positive of those is, the trend for dog owners, dog guardians to, know a lot more about their dogs, to be inquisitive, to want to give their dogs the best lives. And with that comes, a curiosity and an interest into all different things that we can do for our dogs. And of course, starting with their diet is definitely something that many of us want to have a look at as well. So we see it as positive because, the curiosity is essential for this topic in our eyes. It's something that really helps you put together a good diet for your dog. And we think that raw and home cooked diets are definitely growing in popularity as well. So it's not just the interest around them, but we see and hear a lot of people when we're out at markets, when we're out at dog events, and when we're speaking to people in consultation as well for dog nutrition, we see growing interest. And we'd like to go through a little bit of the pros and the cons of feeding in this way. So first of all, I suppose it's worthwhile noting what raw feeding is all about. I suppose raw feeding breaks down into a number of categories, and that have evolved kind of since, I suppose, the 70s, really into different philosophies. Just like human diets, I talk about philosophies because, there's ways of thinking, there are beliefs that come into it. But in the end, one of the most important things, obviously, is getting all of the essential nutrients that your dog needs to survive and thrive into their diet as well. So raw feeding, barf, and things like the prey model, they're all kind of in and around a similar concept of feeding dogs based on, I suppose, their most natural ancestral ways of eating, because as we all know, dogs have evolved from wolves. We know that out in the wild dogs and their relatives tend to go for a kind of a raw meat-based diet. Do we want to get into the conversation of whether dogs are carnivores that have become domesticated or become adapted to be able to eat some plant matter and some grain, or are they omnivores that are extremely carnivorous in their behaviors and in their choices? I don't really know. The answer is kind of it's both of them, because it's in the end it's the same thing. It's kind of sitting on the fence of two different sides of an argument, really. The fact of the matter is most dogs tend to do really well on a fairly meat-based diet, with the addition potentially of some plant matter. So For us at dognutrition.ie in particular, we speak a lot about feeding the dog in front of us. That means taking into account their own needs, their physiology, what their likes are, what their dislikes are, but also what they're able to actually digest. There's very little sense in feeding a dog something that's going to cause them inflammation, cause them problems with their digestion. So, you know, having your eyes open, having a little bit of understanding, getting a little bit of help, and seeing what actually works for your dog, their situation, their health conditions, their stage of life, goes a hell of a long way, because there definitely is no one size fits all for feeding dogs. So we talk about a natural form of feeding for dogs. Like I mentioned, it's a really broad category that are kind of loosely related philosophies in and around a fairly heavily carnivorous diet. And I suppose barf, or biologically appropriate raw food, is probably the most common thing that we see, the most common philosophy. The raw diets contain muscle meat. They usually contain a portion of bone or a bone substitute, and as well as some offal, so some insides, some of those great organ meats that can provide quite a lot of the vitamins and minerals that your dog really needs to thrive. And potentially some plant materials. So the major difference usually seen between something like a prey model and barf is that the prey model would not necessarily use any or many plant materials, whereas barf accounts for some plant material included as well. Now, the reason behind it, I suppose, behind this big difference, well, it's a little difference in reality, because the percentage of the food that it makes up is not massive. But I suppose on one side, the philosophy goes that a wolf in the forest wouldn't necessarily eat too many plant materials. I don't know. They are known to eat some berries and eat some kind of like grasses and some chlorophyll containing plant materials along the way as well. But all in all, realistically, you're still talking about a heavily carnivorous diet, and that's kind of where you go. So just to talk briefly kind of through some of the pros and cons of feeding a raw food diet, because I think it can be interesting for many listeners. So for us, the big pro has always been the full control and the flexibility of your dog's diet. For working with the dog with allergies, it's just amazing to know that you can kind of isolate the meat protein. You can say, okay, this is what I'm feeding. I know exactly what's going in here. And now I'm going to add in these other couple of ingredients. And there you go. You've got a short ingredients list that you've put together yourself, and you know what's in there. You have the flexibility then to say, okay, my dog is actually doing very, very well, and we've identified what the allergen is. For example, in our case, now we can rotate between 3, 4, 5 different kind of animal protein types. So for example, our dog Ruby, she often gets a rotation of beef, of lamb, of sometimes even pork, slightly controversial, and fish proteins as well. So I mean, you can really vary these things out. Ruby has had rabbit as well, and wood pigeon, and all sorts of things. We avoid poultry because we know that Ruby is actually allergic to poultry in her diet. This flexibility then goes through the vegetable side as well for Ruby. So we cook up the veg that need to be cooked. For example, things like potato, sweet potato, pumpkin, butternut squash, all those veg, and those make up quite a lot of her fibre in her diet. And then, of course, we use different natural supplements and an essential omega oil and things like that. But we have control. We can add and subtract to that diet as much and as little as we want to, really. Well, being nutritionists, we have kind of full ability to tinker with what is actually going into our dog. And I suppose this is a myth that we see quite often coming up, like, oh, I've got a sick dog, so I can't do a raw or a kind of a DIY style diet, and we'd actually be of the opposite opinion. We've had quite a few cases now coming through dognutrition.ie where we've done consultations for dogs that have pancreatitis, that have suspected oncoming pancreatitis with their blood levels. We've had dogs that needed to lose weight. We've had dogs that needed to gain weight after surgery, for example. We've had dogs with all sorts of different dietary needs to support their medical conditions. And I caveat this: we are not medical professions. We are not treating their illness. We're creating diets that support their medical needs. But we've been able to play with, for example, fat percentages. We've been able to play with different, inflammatory and anti-inflammatory ingredients so that those dogs are really, really supported. Now that goes as well, obviously, for dogs in a puppy stage right up to your senior dogs that might want more joint support and things like that. Your very energetic dogs that are doing loads and loads of sports, or are working dogs and have a job to do. There's so many cases where you could use this diet. We will get on to the cons, however, so don't feel alone if you think that it might not be for you, which is totally valid and fair as well. We highly believe that at in our consultation side of things, when we're offering a service, we want to be able to work with all different types of diets, so it's definitely not something that we would be talking people into. We like to take into account what their means are. So another pro of the raw diet, and very related as well, I suppose, is that they're highly customizable. You can really hone in on what your own dog's needs are, and then you can tweak things to kind of really fit and help your dog to thrive and live the best of the life that they can. We would also see a raw diet as the least processed way of feeding a dog. Now, that's very difficult for people to come up against us and argue with that, because literally every other type of feeding is more processed. And I mean, if you talk about the most common way to feed in Ireland and across Europe, it's still kibble, and it's extremely processed. They're good kibble, they're bad kibble. There's a whole range out there, and it's a whole world of wonder. But at the end of the day, they're processed often at very high heats. The ingredients are cooked multiple times. Usually the vitamin and mineral component is kind of sprayed onto the kibble at the very end of the processing before it's put into a bag. So definitely this is the way to go if you're looking for something that's way less processed and more natural. Now, it is also worthwhile pointing out that natural doesn't necessarily mean good. For example, a naturally occurring substance in apples are the precursors for cyanide. In the cores of apples, they say not to feed to dogs because in the core and the pips, can cause a buildup of cyanide, which it can in humans too. It's just that it affects dogs considerably more than it does to humans. Natural doesn't necessarily mean great. However, of course, lots of us will know from our own diets, the more natural, the better. Usually, the least processed, the better. Usually, and that is definitely something to be pointed out as a pro on the side of raw. Talking about our natural buzz, in a raw diet, I already mentioned that quite a lot of the vitamins and minerals in this type of feeding come from organ meats. So if you're feeding raw, you're often getting things from really, really high quality and bioavailable vitamins and minerals from liver, from the pancreas, of the animal meats that you're feeding. So some of the cons that typically come up in and around raw: hygiene is super important. Now, this is something that's easily remedied if you're willing to put the work in, keep things clean, have good kitchen hygiene in general, but it's absolutely essential with raw feeding. With raw feeding, there's also a slight danger, or maybe more than slight danger, of malnutrition over time if you're not planning it correctly. So this is the point where I have to really enforce, either get a really good book and become very nerdy in and around raw feeding and understand how different vitamins and minerals are absorbed into the body, and the different ratios you need to be hitting to feed your dog appropriately, or speak with a canine nutritionist and get a plan made specifically for your dog. Those are really your two options. I do not recommend you go out to the supermarket tomorrow and say, you know what, my dog is now going to eat chicken breasts. As I mentioned, you're going to need to balance, some of those natural vitamins, and just chucking in a bit of liver every now and then isn't going to cut it. They do need certain nutrients every single day, and other nutrients are a little bit more stable in the body, and they kind of need them on a weekly basis more so than balanced on a day-to-day basis. But either way, they need to be going into the body over time. On that point, it is also worthwhile pointing out that commercial foods usually in Europe conform to guidelines like FEDIAF, and many of them on tests over the last couple of years have actually failed. So just saying, oh, I feed kibble, therefore my dog is definitely being looked after. Some of these foods are actually, on random testing, not hitting even the minimum values to have your dog survive, never mind thrive. So on a whole, commercially based foods can be a great option for dogs, but it's not a panacea where you can say, oh, this is great, I'll feed this one thing to my dog for the rest of their lives and they're definitely going to be covered. You're putting a lot of your trust in someone else. Obviously, the responsibility comes over to you to then understand, or to get a plan tailored for your dog if you're going the kind of more DIY or raw route. And then another pain point, and I think this is a pain point for lots of people, is that a raw fed diet is highly reliant on refrigeration and freezing. So this means for families that go off on van life holidays for weeks or months during the summertime with their dogs, this can become a bit of a problem. For those of us that are maybe living in smaller city homes that don't have a lot of freezer space, this can be a bit of a problem. It doesn't necessarily have to be. There's ways around it. There are ways to do this that are suitable for many of us, but it is worthwhile noting that just because you like the idea of raw doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to carry it out. So those are the main caveats. I think it is also worthwhile even talking about home cooked in this point as well, because I think if you're looking at all of the different options and you're saying, wow, I really don't have the freezer space, or my dog doesn't always eat when they're supposed to, and of course, when they're supposed to is a human construct, and it's something that you've put in place, but there might be situations where you're leaving food out for longer than, say, 15 or 20 minutes. There might be situations where, equally there are toddlers crawling around after that food has been out for longer than, say, 20 minutes. And you really don't want the dangers of raw meat hanging around certain households. A home cooked diet then can be something that's a little bit more stable. It's obviously not going to have the shelf stability of, let's say, a kibble or a wet food, but it doesn't have the incredible time sensitivity and chilled sensitivity that say your raw food does. So I'm going to actually cover home cooked in another episode. We'll take on that challenge at another time. I kind of want to cover just the raw today, but just know that it's an option. And not a bad one at that. Talking about the different elements of these diets, so I already mentioned quite a bit about the muscle meats that you can use. So the other elements, then you've got your organ meats, and there's multiple ways of getting these into the diet. They can also be supplemented for, and there are options that are completely natural mixes that you can buy frozen, absolutely brilliant ones that are made in Ireland. And there are also powdered mixes that can be added in that work along the lines kind of similarly to the requirements of FEDIAF or the NRC, they do a really, really good job of kind of covering all your dog's bases so that you know that you're feeding them appropriately. And then you've got the bone part. So when we're talking about feeding bone, can be quite a sensitive area, because rightly so, it's a bit of a controversial topic. And I say rightly so because if you're talking about cooked bones, and this is talking about kind of like baked bones, dried bones, things like that, they're extremely dangerous for our dogs. They're extremely dangerous, not because of their nutritional value, not because of the element level, but because they splinter. We know this ourselves. You know, if you found an old bone on the beach, or if you've been making a bone broth and you know, been taking the stuff out to the rubbish, you'll know that these are really brittle and hard once they've dried out after cooking. So that's definitely not going to be something that you want to feed your dog. So that's given a bad name then to bone in general, which we know is really, really good for our dogs. Now, some raw experts, let's say, or you know, superheroes of a particular raw philosophy will say that raw meaty bones are the way to go. So you're usually here looking for kind of a 50-50 split of the 50% bone and then 50% of the meat still on it. And this is fed in a raw state. And it's great for the dog's teeth and for the calcium and for the calcium phosphorus ratio and everything. This isn't an option for a lot of people, and I understand it. Some people have difficulty sourcing these. Some people just don't like meaty bones being chewed up around their apartment floor. We get it. So there are other options. You can buy, you know, bone powder, which has already been powdered into such a fine powder that it's absolutely not going to have that splintering property anymore. It's just a really, really fine powder and kind of ground down as finely as possible. And there are also things like eggshell powder, which can be an option for certain diets as well. It can be really good for pushing up the calcium in a diet that's kind of really lacking in it and needs to be balanced out in that sense. So there's loads of different options out there for the different elements, and we always get asked in, you know, when we're doing any sort of session in and around raw, we get asked, can we, you know, do we have to buy something in a pet shop that's called 80-10-10, or can we go to the supermarket or to the butcher and source our own meats? And the answer is yes, all of those options are great options, and it's just finding the right option for you and making sure that all of the elements are in there, that the calcium is going to be incorporated somehow into the diet appropriately, that all the vitamins and minerals are hit. So again, calling us up at dognutrition.ie for a free discovery call to see what we can do for you could be a great option. I mentioned 80-10-10 without explaining what it was. So usually when you're talking about 80-10-10 as a pre-made mix, they're a great option for some of the dogs out there. That would normally be 80% muscle meat content, 10% of the organ meat, and 10% bone. Usually ground up, but not into a fine powder. It'd be more like a minced bone, let's say, which dogs can totally handle, and most dogs do really, really well on. Of course, with these 80-10-10 mixes, as super convenient as they are and suitable for loads and loads of dogs, if you're going to want to play with things like the fat content, or if you know, if there's anything basically that you want changed in the diet, then those can be a little bit more difficult to work with because they're already kind of pre-made for you. I think one thing that I mentioned previously, now that we've mentioned all the other elements, you know, the plant segment of the whole dietary makeup of raw feeding, if you're adding this in, is hugely important for their fibre. So you do not want a constipated dog walking around the place, especially if it's caused by you yourself. If you look back to wolves, if you look to wild dogs, they're often eating things that our dog just isn't going to get in your typical raw diet. So they're eating things like fur, they're eating skin, they're eating all bits of cartilage, things like that. And these are very, very fibre intense parts of the body. So those are going to be substituted quite a lot by plant material in your raw diets. So usually when we're thinking about the plant section of a canine diet, it's usually not really necessarily to cover vitamin and mineral needs. Those are usually coming from, from the more meaty side or from the supplement side, and the plant-based nutrients are often less bioavailable to dogs in some cases, not in all, but in many cases. Therefore, you'd be looking really at the plant segment to be kind of mostly in and around fibre. Some places where fruits and berries can really, really pack a punch is in the antioxidant side of things. So you might see some of those included as well. But it's just worth pointing out why that plant segment is added in. So all in all, I think it's important to point out that, there's no one diet that's suited for every single dog. I certainly don't think that it's raw. I also certainly don't think it's kibble. And I think it's really, really worthwhile thinking about your own situation, thinking about the dog that's in front of you, and trying out what might be really, really good for them. Get the help that's out there. It'll hopefully last you a lifetime if you start looking into this and get professionals on board that can help you out and can get you really on the right path with a great plan. I know that our plans, we often have little sections in there that you can kind of see what can be exchanged out and what's absolutely essential for your specific dog's diet. So there'll be some flexibility in there. You can add in some seasonality, and all these things are things that we can work with you on. And it can be a really exciting journey to try out something like a DIY raw diet, or an 80-10-10 kind of semi DIY type of diet. We've loads of clients that have been really, really impressed with their own abilities and how actually easy it can be. It's if you can kind of get into the right mindset of it. So absolutely, I think it's worthwhile giving you all a little bit of confidence to do this. You're going to end up on the right path, even if that's not for raw, but please do get a professional on your side. I think it's really, really important to make sure that you're doing these things right, because you're taking a lot of the responsibility into your own hands and you're well able to do it, but just get some professional help along the way. So I've now spoken more than I've ever intended to about raw feeding. Ruby sent us off on this journey a couple of years ago. We're still here, we're still battling it out, and we're bringing out a podcast every single week. So if you've enjoyed the content of this podcast, please do give us a little like or subscribe or whatever you can do on the platform that you're listening to us on. If you've got a friend that will be interested in listening to either this episode or another one of our episodes, let them know that we exist. We love to see this podcast growing. We don't get any money for it. We don't get paid for it. And we put a hell of a lot of time into organising these episodes and making this podcast happen, usually with very entertaining guests. This week, as I mentioned, is a slight exception. But yeah, please do help this podcast grow further and further. If you have any questions, reach out to us on social media. You can find all of our links and ways to get in touch with us in the show notes. Otherwise, we'll be back to you with another podcast next week. Thank you very much for listening in, and I hope to see you soon.